"You're not revenue, Claire," Gavin Dane said, tapping the conference table with the back of his Mont Blanc like he was trying to summon intelligence from the wood grain. "You're furniture with a spreadsheet." The room smelled like burnt coffee and the citrus cleaner facilities used after executive meetings. The big monitor behind him still showed the 4 deals he had pushed through without approvals, all glowing red in my dashboard. Around the table, nobody moved. Nobody helped him. Nobody helped me. I closed my notebook, looked at the red boxes, then at Gavin. "All right," I said. "Let the system read that literally." If you enjoy this kind of story, the quiet kind where incompetence eventually collides with documentation, go ahead and like and subscribe. It helps. So does keeping receipts, which this story has in industrial quantities. My name was Claire Halpern. I was 45 when Valence Grid Systems decided I was slowing growth. Valence was a public B2B software company based in Chicago. We sold logistics and warehouse planning platforms to manufacturers, distributors, and freight operators who liked the word transformation and hated changing anything that worked. Our contracts were large, messy, customized, and full of enough pricing exceptions to make accountants speak in shorter sentences. I had been there for 12 years. My title when this happened was Senior Director of Revenue Integrity, which sounded vague enough to be ignored and important enough to get copied on every ugly email after 6 p.m. In practice, I ran the control layer between sales promising the moon and finance needing something legal, deliverable, and bookable before reporting it to Wall Street. Most people inside the company thought I managed approvals. That was adorable. What I actually built was the thing that let Valence pretend it was a disciplined public company instead of a collection of ambitious adults improvising with customer signatures. The system was called Atlas. I named it after the least appreciated employee in Greek mythology. Atlas was not a dashboard. It was not a spreadsheet. It was not, despite Gavin's later attempt to explain it that way, basically a pricing tracker. Atlas was a quote-to-cash exception architecture I designed after a near disaster in 2017. When one of our regional sales stars closed a $9.6 million multi-year contract with a private freight network in Texas and buried a side letter in the deal file promising implementation credits, custom uptime penalties, and a renewal discount staircase that finance never modeled. Legal signed the master agreement. Implementation started the work. Finance recognized first quarter revenue. Then the customer invoked the side letter during rollout. We spent 11 weeks unwinding it. The external auditors got involved. Our CFO stopped blinking for a month. I spent 3 weekends in conference rooms that smelled like stale carpet and panic, rebuilding the approval chain from scratch. After that, I wrote Atlas. Atlas sat between Salesforce, Ironclad, NetSuite, RevPro, and our implementation tracker. It translated non-standard commercial terms into operational consequences. If a rep offered a custom SLA, Atlas flagged whether support had capacity and whether the SLA language altered revenue recognition timing. If a rep changed milestone billing, Atlas recalculated deferral patterns. If someone buried a rebate in an email instead of the contract, Atlas held the deal from booking until the obligation was mapped, documented, and signed by the right people. It used 412 active rules. Not round numbers. Real ones. Rule 38 handled custom acceptance criteria. Rule 76 dealt with delayed implementation credits. Rule 113 cross-checked reseller margin floors against channel conflicts. Rule 204 looked for contradictory payment terms between the order form and the red lines. Rule 319 flagged non-standard service bundles that changed the standalone selling price allocation. I knew every ugly corner of it because I built it while also doing my regular job, which is how women often get promoted into invisible authority. We build the bridge, then keep driving on it while everyone else discusses traffic. Atlas also had something more important than code. It had ownership. After the 2017 audit scare, our board approved Revenue Control Matrix RC-17. Under RC-17, All non-standard enterprise contracts above $500,000 or involving custom concessions required sign-off from a certified control owner with delegated pricing variance authority and ASC 606 exception accountability. That was me. Not my department. Not my boss. Me. The language was specific because I wrote it with internal audit and then spent 2 hours in a room with outside counsel explaining why shared accountability was just a decorative phrase for nobody will go to jail, but the quarter will still be wrong. My digital approval certificate was tied to my employee credential in ironclad and mirrored into RevPro. If I approved a contract, Atlas released the workflow. If I did not, the contract stayed on exception hold. If I left the company without a tested successor, RC 17 required automatic suspension of non-standard revenue release until the control was reassigned, documented, and validated by internal audit. That was not my private trap. It was public company governance. Very boring when respected. Very cinematic when ignored. I did not build Atlas because I liked control. I built it because salespeople, especially successful ones, enjoy treating downstream labor as an imaginary kingdom that appears after signatures. They think a contract becomes real because someone important smiles beside it. It does not. It becomes real when legal, finance, implementation, support, security, and sometimes procurement all agree not to sue one another afterward. Before Gavin arrived, Valence was demanding but workable. Our CEO, Martin Dane, was a founder in the way founders often age into leadership. He was good with vision, better with earnings calls, and deeply in love with the version of himself that could still say, "We move fast," without anyone openly laughing. But for years, he had one excellent habit. He respected the people who prevented expensive embarrassment. Our CFO, Nora Feld, understood controls. She did not worship them, which I appreciated, but she understood that public company revenue is less a number than a chain of sworn statements wearing a tie. Legal was led by Mona Patel, who had the driest voice in Illinois and the rare gift of being precise without being slow. If you asked her a yes or no question, she would answer, yes, if you enjoy litigation, and somehow that counted as legal advice and friendship. In customer implementation, Daniel Kim ran a team of exhausted grown adults who could turn 4 pages of irresponsible sales language into an actual project plan, usually at the expense of their personal lives. I trusted him completely. He trusted me because I never told him a bad contract was just ops being rigid. Over 12 years, I cleaned up 31 quarter-end contract scrambles, prevented 7 potential revenue misstatements, rewrote our enterprise discount ladder, closed 2 audit findings, and quietly stopped 3 sales executives from promising things our product did not do. One of those executives later got promoted. That is not bitterness. It is arithmetic. I had saved a $14.2 million renewal by finding a buried rollback clause in a reseller amendment nobody else had read. I had stopped a $6.8 million healthcare contract from being booked incorrectly because someone had embedded patient data obligations in a pricing appendix. I had once taken a red-eye back from Phoenix, gone straight to the office in the same blazer, and rebuilt an entire commission split structure in 90 minutes because a regional vice president wanted to simplify channel economics by ignoring math. Nobody gave me awards. I did not need awards. I needed people to stop acting surprised when the house stayed standing. For years, enough of them did. My team was small and brutally good. 2 revenue analysts. 1 contracts operations manager. 1 pricing architect. 1 implementation liaison I fought to keep funded every budget cycle because somebody always wanted to call the role redundant right before a messy deal exploded. We were not glamorous. We were the air traffic control layer for promises. Sales tolerated us because we made their deals bookable. Finance tolerated us because we kept the quarter clean. Legal tolerated us because we turned wishful language into documents adults could survive. I trained everyone obsessively. Every exception type had a playbook. Every non-standard concession had a mapping logic. Every escalation had owners, timestamps, and backup routing. I documented everything because I had been in corporate life long enough to know 2 facts. First, if it is not written down, someone more confident than smart will eventually deny it happened. Second, if you save a company often enough, they start believing survival is a feature of the building. Then Martin's son came in. Gavin Dane was 34 and had the posture of a man who had never had to wait for a callback. Tall, gym-built, expensive white sneakers with dark suits, because somewhere in executive culture, looking underdressed became a brand strategy. He wore a steel sports watch so large it looked like a hostage situation for his wrist. His hair was always cut within an inch of a political career, and he smiled with his mouth first and his eyes only if there was a photographer nearby. He arrived from a venture-backed sports media company in Los Angeles with exactly 3 years of enterprise sales experience and a title that should have required either scar tissue or competence. Executive Vice President of Enterprise Revenue. Martin announced it in an all-hands with the phrase, "Next Generation Commercial Energy." That was our first warning. People who understand revenue do not describe it as energy. They describe it as contracts, obligations, cash timing, churn risk, and whether the customer is lying to you politely. Gavin walked in on a Monday morning, shook hands like he was conducting auditions, and by Wednesday had renamed the sales floor the engine room. By Friday, he had told 3 different departments that they needed less process and more belief. Belief. I have worked in public companies for 20 years. Belief has never once saved a quarter. His power was not only his last name, though that certainly helped. Martin gave him house accounts, inherited relationships, and the sort of protection that turns recklessness into confidence. Gavin wasn't brilliant. He was adjacent to consequence, which can look very similar for a while. His first major account win was a $12 million expansion with Redline Freight, which he later used as evidence that old-school discipline was slowing the company down. What he left out was that Redline had been nurtured for 5 years by a departing executive, and that my team spent 19 days cleaning up his pricing commitments before the deal could be recognized. He did not lie about winning. He simply omitted the adult supervision. That became his habit. He spoke in phrases clearly borrowed from podcasts hosted by men who mistake certainty for insight. Speed is strategy. Friction is fear in a suit. We can't audit our way to category leadership. That last one he said while staring directly at Nora, which was a very efficient way to tell a CFO you had been raised indoors. At his first quarterly forecast review, he clicked through a slide deck full of large numbers, bright arrows, and almost no nouns anyone could operationalize. When I asked whether the $8.4 million Pacific Rail opportunity included the custom onboarding credits his rep had mentioned in email, Gavin smiled and said, "Claire, this is why sales can't bring you into the early stages. You hear momentum and translate it into breaks." I said, "I hear obligations and translate them into public reporting." Around the table, people looked down at their laptops. That is what professionals do when they would like to live. He did not understand what I actually did. That part was genuine. Gavin thought deals became real when customers verbally committed and his team entered a close state that made him look competent. He treated revenue integrity like a ceremonial checkpoint, something between admin and weather. Once, in a leadership meeting, he pointed at the Atlas queue on the screen and said, "Why do 3 systems need to know the same contract exists? It's one PDF." Mona, who had more patience than most surgeons, said, "Because PDFs are not accounting policies." Gavin laughed like she had contributed to the joke. Another time, he walked onto my floor without warning and leaned over one of my analysts, Emma, while she was reconciling bundled service terms. "What's the holdup on Harper Industrial?" he asked. Emma looked up. The rep promised a termination for convenience, right tied to implementation milestones. "We're modeling weather." Gavin cut her off with a flick of 2 fingers. "Don't model it. Solve it." Then he looked at me and smiled. "This team spends a lot of time admiring problems." I said nothing. Emma said nothing. After he left, Emma stared at her screen for a full 10 seconds and then whispered, "Did he just shoo me?" "Yes," I said. "Try not to become a bird." She laughed because she was 29 and still had optimism. She quit 4 months later. That was the real damage Gavin did, and it took Martin far too long to notice because attrition has bad branding. It arrives one resignation at a time. One burned-out analyst. One implementation lead who stops volunteering for high-risk accounts. One contracts manager who decides remote work for a quieter company sounds like medicine. Gavin did not shout often. That would have been easier to identify. His style was casual disrespect. He interrupted women more than men, but never enough in one meeting for HR to care. He sent 11:47 p.m. messages that said, "Need you to clean this up before morning." He copied people's bosses on minor delays. He told a pricing manager in front of sales, "If you need certainty before you act, you're in the wrong function." He asked Daniel Kim, who had been at Valence for 9 years, whether implementation was still operating with that old-school service mindset. Daniel replied, "We are operating with calendars." Daniel left 6 months later for a company where apparently people enjoyed not being insulted before lunch. Gavin loved top performer mythology because it explained his life to him. He closed big numbers. Therefore, anything slowing him down must be weakness, process addiction, or what he called back-office insecurity. Martin protected all of it. At first, he did it in the polished founder way. "Gavin's pushing us out of our comfort zone." Strong personalities create temporary turbulence. Let's not confuse change fatigue with leadership failure. Then the attrition started appearing on staffing reports. My pricing architect left for a private equity portfolio company in Minneapolis. Our contracts operations manager, Luis, accepted a role at a bank. Daniel left. A security reviewer transferred internally. One of Nora's senior revenue accountants retired 3 years early after Gavin told her on a call, "Accounting doesn't own timing. Sales does." That sentence alone should have required a supervised environment. Every exit interview said the same thing in slightly more polite words. Gavin created chaos. Gavin made promises without review. Gavin treated expertise as obstruction. Gavin burned out everyone who fixed his work. HR summarized it as cross-functional tension. Of course they did. At one point, Mona and I sat in her office with the door half shut, looking over another resignation. Mona set the paper down and said, "If you were not Martin's son, this would already be a liability presentation." Yes. You know this ends in either a restatement or a board memo. Possibly both. She adjusted her glasses. "You're still documenting everything?" I started before he knew what a side letter was. "Good," she said. "I prefer disasters that come with timestamps." So did I. That was the thing about working quietly for long enough. People thought calm meant passive. They thought patience meant comfort. What they did not know was that I built systems because systems remember when people become political. The specific disaster that triggered everything was a cluster of quarter-end deals Gavin pushed through in late September. For large enterprise contracts. Combined value, $27.8 million in total contract value, $8.1 million in current year recognizable revenue if structured properly. None were structured properly. One promised retroactive service credits if implementation exceeded 120 days, which changed variable consideration treatment. One included a custom migration package our services team had not scoped. One contained a handwritten discount waterfall in an email thread rather than the executed order form. The biggest one, a $9.4 million deal with a regional distribution network called Northspan, included an oral promise of termination rights tied to a feature our product team had not shipped. I caught all 4 in Atlas because Atlas had no respect for charm. The queue lit up red. Exception hold. Missing obligations. Unmapped concessions. Revenue release suspended. Standard. Fixable. Annoying. My favorite kind of problem. I sent Gavin the summary. Then I sent it again in shorter words. He responded with one line. Unacceptable. We are booking these this quarter. That was not how accounting worked, but it was a very good example of how Gavin's mind worked. He believed urgency had legal force. I escalated to Nora and Mona as required. We scheduled a review for Friday morning. Gavin arrived 11 minutes late, carrying a coffee that smelled like burned hazelnut syrup and irritation. Martin joined by video from New York. 2 VPs from sales dialed in. Nora was there. Mona was there. I brought the Atlas queue, the deal files, and the side letter emails. I walked through the first contract. Northspan. Unapproved termination language. Variable consideration not modeled. Recognition risk. Gavin interrupted before slide 2. We are not doing this theater again. I kept speaking. Slide 3. Harbor access. Custom uptime penalties promised over text. No service capacity sign-off. Claire. Slide 4. Atlas flagged mismatch between order form and email concession history. Claire. I looked up. Gavin leaned back in his chair, one ankle across his knee, as if posture could substitute for substance. This is exactly what I'm talking about. We have a team that confuses governance with value creation. Nora said, Gavin. He kept going. No, seriously. We're sitting on almost $28 million because Claire's team wants every commercial conversation embalmed before we move. Mona said, because plaintiffs enjoy email. He ignored her. Martin's face on the screen tightened in that familiar founder-parent way. He wanted the meeting to end without admitting his son had brought a live grenade to finance. I said, the deals can still close. They cannot be recognized until the concessions are documented and remapped. Gavin laughed softly. There it is. The voice of managed decline. Nobody spoke. The HVAC hissed. Someone on the video line breathed too close to a microphone. Then Gavin said the sentence from the beginning. You're not revenue, Claire. You're furniture with a spreadsheet. Martin should have stopped him. He did not. Instead, he said, we need solution-oriented leadership here. That was the moment. Not the insult. The endorsement. I looked at Martin on the screen. Then at Nora. Then at the red Atlas queue. People think the crucial moment in stories like this feels dramatic. It usually feels clean. I closed my notebook. All right, I said. Let the system read that literally. Gavin frowned. What does that mean? I stood. Nora looked at me once. Long enough to understand. Mona did too. Martin said, Claire, sit down. We're not finished. I am. Then I left the conference room. Nobody followed me immediately. That was wise. I walked back to my office, closed the door, and sat for exactly 90 seconds. Long enough to confirm my pulse was steady. Long enough to let the shape of the decision settle into place. Then I opened the file I had hoped I would never need. Control Owner Departure Notice. RC-17. Form CO4. I had created the template myself 5 years earlier with internal audit. Another small gift to my future. I did not resign in anger. I did not type dramatically. I did not clear my desk into a box while glaring at framed value statements. I completed a professional obligation. At 11:14 a.m., I sent my resignation to HR, Nora, Mona, internal audit, and the audit committee administrator. Effective immediately, I am resigning from my role as Senior Director of Revenue Integrity. As current certified control owner under RC-17 and delegated authority holder for non-standard enterprise revenue approvals, I am notifying Valence of a control owner vacancy effective upon separation. Per RC-17 Section 4.3, all in-flight non-standard contracts and revenue releases subject to exception review must remain on automatic hold until successor designation, documentation transfer, and testing are completed. No emotion. Just architecture. At 11:19 a.m., I opened Ironclad admin settings and triggered the control owner separation workflow tied to my certificate. That disabled my digital approval token and marked all pending exception packets as suspended due to inactive certifier status. At 11:22, I submitted the RevPro authorization withdrawal request. Same effect. Exception queue frozen. No releases. No manual override without CFO, internal audit, and audit committee sign-off. At 11:26, I sent a preservation notice to IT regarding the Atlas Logic repository, exception decision logs, and concession mapping archive. Not because I thought anyone would tamper with them. Because hope is not a control. At 11:31, I emailed our external audit partner at Bremer and Holt. As disclosed under RC-17, there is now a control owner vacancy affecting non-standard enterprise revenue approvals. Please direct all related testing and inquiries to management and internal audit. I am no longer authorized to act on behalf of Valence. At 11:35, Mona called me. I answered. Well, she said. That was precise. Yes. Are you leaving the building? In 10 minutes. Good. Gavin is telling people IT can just turn Atlas back on. Can they? No. Then I'll enjoy lunch. A pause. Then Mona said, for what it's worth, you were right. I know. You say that in the calmest possible way. It's very irritating. I almost smiled. That's why we've worked so well together. I packed deliberately. Laptop return form. Personal mug. Notebook. Scarf from the back of my chair. One framed photo of my sister's family at Lake Geneva. I left the awards plaque from 2021 because corporate acrylic always looks sad in natural light. In the hallway, I passed Nora. She stopped beside my door, lowered her voice, and said, "How bad is the hold?" "Everything above standard thresholds." Her mouth tightened. "So all four?" "Yes." "And anything else with unresolved concessions?" "Yes." She nodded once. Understood. There was no speech. That was why I respected her. At the elevator bank, Gavin caught up to me, moving quickly enough that his cologne arrived first. Cedar. Pepper. Expensive nonsense. "This is absurd," he said. "You don't get to grandstand because a few deals need cleanup." I pressed the elevator button. "I'm not grandstanding. You're freezing revenue over process." I looked at him. "No. I'm freezing it over promises you made without structure." He shook his head like I was disappointing a teacher. "You think the company can't function without you." There are many sentences arrogant men use when they are actually speaking about themselves. "I think the policy will function exactly as written," I said. The elevator opened. I stepped in. He put one hand on the door. "Claire, be reasonable." I met his eyes. I already was. The doors closed. That afternoon I drove home through light rain and heavier traffic than I wanted. I stopped at a grocery store and bought lemons, chicken, pasta, and decent bread. The cashier asked whether I wanted paper or plastic, which felt like a refreshingly solvable question. At home, I changed into a sweater, tied my hair up, and made dinner while the company began discovering that governance has a personality when ignored long enough. At 1:08 p.m., 14 minutes after my resignation circulated, my personal phone lit up with a text from Emma, my former analyst. "Did you really just trigger CO4? "Yes." She sent back one word. "Finally." At 1:22, Daniel Kim texted. "I assume Gavin has now met consequences." "Yes." He replied with a thumbs up and nothing else. Daniel was not a man who wasted celebration. At 2:03 my phone showed the first call from Gavin. I did not answer. At 2:07 Nora. At 2:11 HR. At 2:16 Martin. By 3 p.m. I had 9 missed calls, 6 texts, and 1 email from Gavin marked urgent. "Claire, there appears to be confusion around system permissions. Need you to clarify immediately." Confusion. A lovely word for a public company control operating exactly as designed. I forwarded it to Mona's personal email because she had asked me to keep her entertained. Then I browned the chicken, salted the pasta water, and let my dog, Poppy, out into the yard. She was a 7-year-old mutt with one folded ear and a worldview based entirely on whether squirrels were being appropriately supervised. By 7:30 that night, I was on my couch with a blanket and an old mystery series while Valence held emergency calls I was no longer paid to improve. I slept 8 hours. They thought I was setting a trap. What they didn't know is that traps are emotional. Controls are administrative. The first stage of panic began the next morning. Technical failure. Clean. Immediate. At 8:14 a.m., the quarter close operations channel lit up, according to 3 people who later sent me screenshots. Atlas had marked the 4 contracts as exception hold and no active control owner. RevPro mirrored the status. NetSuite would not open revenue schedules. Ironclad blocked signature release packets tied to custom terms. Gavin did what incompetent executives always do first. He called IT. IT checked authentication, routing, and vendor uptime. All green. He called RevOps systems. They confirmed the workflow had not broken. It had complied. He called internal audit. Internal audit, who rarely get to enjoy being popular, explained that RC 17 required temporary suspension until a new control owner was formally designated and tested. Gavin asked how long that took. The answer, according to someone on the call, was not same day. Then he tried the oldest trick in modern business: manual override. He had one of his directors export the deal packets from Salesforce and send them directly to finance with the subject line for booking, "Executive approved." Nora rejected all 4 within 18 minutes. Reason: missing control record IDs, unresolved concession mapping, inactive certifier status. That was stage 1. Stage 2 arrived before lunch. Without Atlas releasing the workflows, implementation could not generate final project baselines for the 4 accounts because key contract variables were still unresolved. The Northspan deal included milestone-based termination language the implementation system could not model without a concession map. Harbor Access had custom service penalties that support had never accepted. Pacific Delta Logistics had committed migration resources against dates already reserved for another client. One contract referenced a commercial understanding per August email, which is not a legal phrase, but apparently sounds sexy in sales. Daniel Kim, now happily employed elsewhere, texted me at noon. A former PM just called. Says nobody knows what the customer was actually promised. That landed exactly as it should have. Nobody knows what the customer was actually promised. There are few better summaries of a toxic top performer's business model. At 12:37 p.m., Gavin left his first voicemail. "Claire, call me back. This is an operational issue, not a political one. We just need to get the approvals remapped." He still thought remapped was a verb people could use casually. I deleted the voicemail. At 1:05 p.m., Martin called. I let it ring. At 1:19 p.m., Nora texted. "We may have broader exposure. Call if you're willing." I did not call yet. Not because Nora did not deserve help. Because willingness is not the same as authority, and I had no intention of stepping halfway back into a company that had just told me I was furniture. Stage 3 began on day 2, when people started trying to recreate Atlas with spreadsheets. This was my favorite phase because it always happens before adults accept reality. Some manager somewhere says, "How hard can it be?" Then 4 smart people lose 11 hours proving the answer is very. A sales operations director named Ben, who once described ASC 606 as that finance religion, tried to build a temporary exception tracker in Excel. He captured contract value, customer name, discount percentage, and close date. He forgot variable consideration, service carve-outs, custom liability caps, acceptance criteria dependencies, channel conflicts, and revenue allocation impacts. So, in fairness, he captured the colored pencils. By late afternoon, finance rejected the spreadsheet. No audit trail. No control logic. No sign-off path. No linkage to source obligations. Then Ben tried to simplify the problem by asking reps to restate all customer concessions in a standardized form. That failed because reps do not remember their own promises once those promises become risky. 3 submitted forms contradicted the executed order forms. One rep wrote, "Customer verbally aligned to flexibility." I still do not know what that means. I hope he doesn't either. At 4:42 p.m., Gavin sent me a text. "Need a courtesy call. This has gone too far." I looked at it while Poppy insisted on investigating a leaf in the yard with the seriousness of a homicide detective. Too far. An interesting phrase from a man who had spent a year treating downstream labor like an inconvenience, and now discovered inconvenience had a policy reference. By the end of that week, stage 4 arrived. People started realizing the attrition had not been random. Emma, Luis, Daniel, the revenue accountant, the security reviewer. Individually, each exit had been survivable. Collectively, they were the removal of every person who knew how Gavin's deals became real after he announced them. Mona texted me Friday at 6:12 p.m. "They are searching old folders for your concession crosswalks. There are folder copies." I know. That was the point. The crosswalks were not missing because I had hidden them. They lived inside Atlas because Atlas was the controlled system of record. Every mapping decision, Every exception rationale, every sequence dependency sat in the decision logs and rules engine. You could export reports. You could not replace the architecture with good intentions and a shared drive. What they had lost was not knowledge in the vague, flattering sense executives use after firing people. They had lost structure. You cannot search a structure in old email. Friday night, I finally took Nora's call. I did it from my kitchen while chopping shallots because I find other people's urgency easier to tolerate if I am doing something with a knife. How bad? I asked. Nora exhaled. We have 11 deals in hold now, not 4. I stopped chopping. 11. Gavin's team had been staging others for quarter end. Atlas never released the packets because they were still in draft exception review. Without a control owner, they froze too. What's the total value? $31.6 million TCV. About $9.2 million current year exposure. I resumed chopping. Anyone tell Martin? Yes. And? He asked whether we can designate a temporary approver. Can you? Not without testing. Internal audit said minimum 3 weeks if we pull people off everything else. I let that sit. 3 weeks at quarter close is not a timeline. It is a weather event. Nora continued. There's more. One of the held deals was already included in Gavin's board pipeline commentary. There it was. The second problem. Not just delayed revenue. Misrepresented certainty. Has investor relations been told? Not yet. That told me everything about the next 72 hours. Before hanging up, Nora said quietly, I should have stepped in sooner. Yes, I said. She did not defend herself. Another reason I respected her. On Monday morning, Stage 5 walked into the lobby wearing visitor badges. The external auditors were on site. Quarter-end interim testing. Bremer and Holt had already received my control owner vacancy notice. They also had the RC-17 policy, the board minutes approving it, and the evidence trail showing non-standard deals now sat on hold without a tested successor. They requested 3 things by 10 a.m. Evidence of interim control assignment. Evidence of concession mapping completeness for the held deals. Evidence that management had not recognized revenue on any impacted contracts. Valence had only one of those 3. And only because Nora was still employed. At 10:36 a.m., Martin's chief of staff texted me. Would you consider a short call with Martin? Strictly informational. I did not reply. At 11:02, Gavin called twice in 4 minutes. No voicemail. At 11:17, Martin left one. Claire, we need to clear up what appears to be an over-engineered control failure. Please call me. Over-engineered. That was charming. I imagined 2 auditors, 1 CFO, and an entire quarter all pausing to appreciate the language. Then came the gut punch. At 1:14 p.m., Mona called from a conference room whispering in the kind of controlled voice lawyers use when events have become billable and humiliating. Northspan found the August email. I leaned against the counter. The oral termination promise? It wasn't oral. Gavin's rep summarized it in writing after a dinner. The customer replied, thanks for confirming. I closed my eyes for a second. Where was it? In the rep's Gmail. Forwarded nowhere. Uploaded nowhere. Of course. Mona continued. The customer's procurement lead sent it this morning and asked whether it is part of the agreement. And? We said it is under review. How did they respond? They paused signature and asked for a corrected commercial package within 48 hours. Northspan was the biggest of the 4. $9.4 million. If it paused, Gavin's entire quarter story changed shape in front of the board. Mona was quiet for a moment. Then she said, he built a career on the assumption someone else would translate his improvising into reality. Yes. Well, she said, dry as paper, the translators appear to have unionized. I laughed once. She deserved that. Stage 6 arrived with the market. Valence pre-announced that quarter close timing could be affected by extended contract review procedures on a subset of enterprise transactions. That was the sort of sentence investor relations writes when nobody has been honest enough yet. Analysts did what analysts do. They smelled blood through adjective fog. By 2:40 p.m. the stock was down 17%. By the close, it was down 23%. An $86 million market cap loss because Martin had spent a year protecting his son from the consequences of being wrong in public. At 6:08 p.m., Emma texted, "My old team is watching the ticker like it's live theater." I sent back, "Charge admission." Then came the 14 missed calls. Not over a month. Over 2 days. Martin. Gavin. HR. Martin again. A board administrator. Gavin again. One unknown New York number that turned out to be outside counsel. Nora. Martin. Gavin. Martin. Unknown again. Gavin. Nora. The voicemails changed tone in order. First, confusion. Then urgency. Then entitlement. Then actual fear. Gavin's third voicemail was my favorite. "Claire, this is spiraling because people are dramatizing system behavior they don't fully understand." That sentence did a lot of work. What he meant was, please return and explain my own damage in a way that doesn't embarrass me. Martin's second voicemail was more honest. "We need you to help stabilize this before the audit committee meets." There it was. Before the audit committee meets. Not because he missed me. Not because he respected the work. Because the room he actually feared had entered the calendar. On Wednesday morning, I got a call from Laura Chen. Laura was Valence's lead independent director and chair of the audit committee. Former CFO. Precise. Never loud. She had the kind of voice that made weak people over-explain. I answered. "Claire." "Laura. Are you represented?" "Yes." "Good. I have counsel too. I'd like to understand one thing directly from you. If no successor control owner was in place, was the hold mandatory?" "Yes." "Could management override it unilaterally?" "No." "Could they have known that?" "Yes." A pause. "How?" Board minutes. RC 17, Annual Control Certification. Training logs. And 3 written escalations from me in the last 9 months regarding cross-functional attrition tied to enterprise exception handling. Another pause. This one had weight. Then Laura said, "I see." She did. That was the first useful phrase anyone with real authority had offered all week. She continued. "The audit committee is meeting at 4 p.m. We will ask management for a full chronology." "You should. Would you attend with counsel if requested?" "Yes." That was the turning point. Not because I had won anything yet. Because an adult had finally asked the right question. I spent that afternoon at Elena Ruiz's office. Elena had represented me years earlier on an equity comp matter and still had the same calm expression of someone who charged by the hour and disliked sloppy thinking. We prepared a timeline. Not a performance. A timeline. Attrition dates. Escalation emails. RC 17 references. Atlas certification structure. The September deal cluster. The Friday meeting. The resignation. The control owner separation notice. Facts. Dates. Attachments. At 3:47 p.m. Elena got the formal request. Would Claire Halpern be available to join the audit committee meeting at 4:30 p.m. Central with counsel present? Yes. The boardroom on the 27th floor had floor-to-ceiling windows and the smell of expensive wood that never quite masks anxiety. I had spent years entering that room to explain risks after other people created them. This time I entered as an external witness. Martin was there. Nora was there. Mona was there. Laura and 3 other directors were there. Gavin was there too, somehow still trying to sit like he belonged at the center of the problem. He looked worse. Less sleep. Too tight. The shine had gone off him in uneven places. Laura opened directly. "Claire, thank you for joining us. We need clarity." I nodded. Elena sat beside me with a legal pad and the relaxed posture of a woman billing accurately. Laura gestured to Martin. "Management has characterized this as a system discontinuity triggered by an abrupt resignation." I looked at Martin. Then at Gavin. Then back to Laura. It was a control vacancy triggered by leadership disregarding documented policy. No one interrupted. I continued. Atlas did exactly what RC 17 required. Non-standard enterprise contracts cannot be released without an active certified control owner because those contracts contain obligations that alter revenue timing, service costs, customer remedies, or all 3. Gavin leaned forward. We're not disputing controls exist. We're disputing whether Claire intentionally structured them to make herself irreplaceable. There it was. Desperation always reaches for vanity. I turned to him. No. I structured them so your side letters wouldn't become securities litigation. Silence. Real silence this time. Heavy enough to hear the air system. Laura asked, was Valence warned about attrition risk? Yes. How often? At least 3 formal times by me. Repeatedly by department leaders in staffing reviews. Informally by legal and finance. Nora said, that is correct. Mona said, also correct. Laura looked at Martin. He did not meet her eyes. Then she asked Gavin, did you refer to revenue integrity as furniture with a spreadsheet in a contract review meeting? Gavin's jaw moved once. That's being taken out of context. Was it said? He looked at Martin, which told the whole story. Yes. Laura nodded slowly, the way people do when a puzzle piece is ugly but finally fits. Then Gavin made his worst mistake. He turned toward me and said, fine. Name your number. Just come back in and tell them Atlas is operable. One afternoon. We don't need a morality play. A morality play. I almost appreciated the phrase. He still thought the problem was emotion. I folded my hands on the table. You fired the translator and kept the promises, I said. That isn't a morality play. That's a sequencing failure. Laura looked at me. Are you willing to assist the company? Yes, I said. On terms that prevent this from recurring. Martin spoke quickly, relief arriving too early. We can discuss that. No, Elena said. You can listen. There are few sounds more comforting than your attorney using fewer words than the men in the room. I laid out the terms. First, I would not return as an employee. Valence had already made its leadership judgment. I had no interest in becoming a decorative rescue with a badge. Second, I would accept a 45-day emergency consulting engagement at $18,000 per day, 10-day minimum retainer, billed weekly. Not because I wanted to punish them. Because untangling architectural negligence at quarter close is specialty surgery, not hourly admin. Third, I would report directly to the audit committee and CFO for the duration of the engagement. No revenue authority or communication through Gavin. None. Fourth, Gavin would be removed immediately from approval authority over non-standard contracts, customer concession language, forecast commentary related to unapproved deals, and all management of revenue integrity, legal, or implementation dependencies. Fifth, Valence would fund the rehiring or replacement of 3 critical roles with compensation corrections. I named them specifically. Senior Pricing Architect, Contracts Operations Lead, Implementation Commercial Liaison. Sixth, management would issue a written chronology acknowledging prior warnings, attrition impacts, and the fact that the control hold was a required policy response, not a personal act of retaliation. Seventh, the company would disclose the material weakness, if external auditors required it, without inventing softer words to protect reputations. Martin looked like someone had placed a cold metal object in his chair. Gavin said, that's insane. Laura did not look at him when she answered. No, she said. This is expensive. There is a difference. Then she looked at me. Anything else? Yes, I said. I choose the interim successor control owner after testing, subject to audit committee approval. Not sales. Not Martin. Me. Gavin actually laughed. You don't get to run the company because you built a workflow. I looked at him. No. I get to define the repair because you mistook the workflow for the work. That landed exactly where it needed to. Laura asked Martin whether management accepted the terms. He hesitated for 3 seconds too long. Then Nora said, very quietly, if we do not accept, we will not close the quarter cleanly. Mona added, and if we attempt to close it uncleanly, I will resign before signing anything. That was a useful contribution. Martin finally nodded. We accept. Gavin turned to him. You cannot be serious. Martin snapped then. Not theatrically. Not loudly. But with the flat, exhausted anger of a man finally realizing nepotism had produced invoices. Enough, Gavin. The room went still. Laura said, recorded. Terms accepted at 5:18 p.m. That was the confrontation. No screaming. No speeches. just authority relocating itself. Over the next 45 days, I did what I had always done. I made the system tell the truth. I rebuilt the quarter close pathway. I validated 11 held deals and rejected 3 permanently because the customer promises could not be supported as written. I supervised a controlled export of Atlas rule logic for interim governance. I trained Nora's chosen successor, a disciplined finance director named Arun Mehta who had something rare and therefore valuable. He knew what he didn't know. I rehired Emma as senior pricing architect at a 22% increase. Luis returned as contracts operations lead for 18% more and 1 fewer reason to hate Tuesdays. A woman named Marisol Vega, who had spent years in implementation governance at a competitor, came in as liaison and immediately started asking the kind of sharp calendar questions that make sales executives uncomfortable in healthy ways. Gavin was removed from the earnings prep call, then from the exception review, then from direct oversight of enterprise contracting altogether. Publicly, the company said it was realigning commercial accountability. Internally, everyone understood he had finally been placed where family members go when adults take back the keys. The permanent damage was not reversible. Northspan did not sign that quarter. They came back 5 months later on smaller terms, after forcing Valence into tighter service obligations and a lower first-year price. Lost value, $3.1 million. One existing customer, Redwood Municipal Logistics, terminated its renewal process entirely after discovering Gavin's team had verbally promised custom support ratios never documented in the contract. Lost value, $11.8 million over 3 years. Bremer and Holt concluded that Valence had a material weakness in controls over non-standard enterprise revenue approvals, specifically tied to succession planning, concession mapping, and management override pressure. That language went into the filing. The company delayed earnings by 9 days. The stock never recovered to its prior level while I was there. The initial 23% drop clawed back partially, then settled about 14% below pre-crisis levels for the next 2 quarters. Market cap damage, depending on the day you measured it, hovered between $52 million and $86 million. Consulting fees, legal review, rehiring costs, customer concessions, lost bookings, and audit remediation added another $6.4 million. Altogether, the thing they had tried to streamline by humiliating me in a meeting wound up costing them over 100 times my annual salary. That kind of symmetry is why I no longer believe in irony as a literary device. Corporate life does it better. Martin stayed on as CEO for another 6 months, then shifted to executive chair after the board announced a leadership evolution. Gavin remained briefly under a reduced commercial strategy title that sounded like a witness protection program for bad judgment. Then he left to pursue new opportunities. I did not ask where. I hoped the opportunities were heavily supervised. What mattered more was that Valence never recovered its old mythology. People stopped saying, "Gavin just gets it done." They started asking, what would this require downstream? Which is not glamorous, but glamour is usually what companies use right before lawyers arrive. When my 45 days ended, I walked out exactly once more. This time no one blocked the elevator. Nora shook my hand and said, "You saved us." I said, "I stabilized the reporting. Saving yourselves is the part after." Mona hugged me once, quickly, as if afraid someone would mistake it for a merger. Then she said, "If you ever start your own firm, send the contracts to me before you become successful and intolerable." Deal. Laura called 2 days later and asked if I would consider a board advisory role for a portfolio company she chaired. I declined. Not because I wasn't interested. Because something else had already opened. Arbor Peak Systems, a private industrial software company in Minneapolis, had been watching the Valence filing with professional fascination and the healthy greed of people who recognize operational talent in the news. Their CFO called, then their CEO, then their board chair. They wanted someone to build commercial architecture before growth broke them. A novel concept. I joined them 7 weeks later as Chief Revenue Architecture Officer. Yes, the title was ridiculous. I accepted it anyway because the role was real, the reporting line was direct, and the CEO had one beautiful habit. When she did not understand something, she said, explain it to me like I'm responsible for it. I moved into a corner office with natural light, one wall of white boards, and exactly zero inspirational vinyl lettering. Emma came with me 4 months later. Luis followed after bonus season. Marisol referred a contracts lead who had once made a private equity partner cry during diligence by explaining indemnity slowly. We built a commercial governance model from the beginning instead of after a public embarrassment. Imagine that. At Arbor Peak, sales could still push. Ambition did not offend me. Sloppiness did. We built a clean exception ladder, implementation gating tied to actual capacity, a margin model people could understand without prayer, and succession documents that lived in more than one human brain. I stopped carrying a second laptop home every night. I started cooking again without checking Slack between stirring and plating. On Saturday mornings, I took Poppy to the lake near my apartment and drank coffee that did not come from an office machine with a moral injury. In winter, the air hurt a little, and I liked that. It felt honest. 3 months into the new role, I got a LinkedIn notification. Gavin Dane had viewed my profile. I looked at it for 4 full seconds. Then I closed the app and kept walking. Some endings do not need dialogue. A few weeks later, an industry newsletter ran a story on Arbor Peak's new deal governance framework. The article quoted our CEO, our CFO, and me. My quote was typical of me. Slightly dry. More accurate than sexy. Revenue quality is not the opposite of growth. It is what keeps growth from becoming a legal event. Emma texted me a screenshot with 3 words. Still furniture, huh? I laughed hard enough to startle Poppy. I thought sometimes about that meeting at Valence. The cleaner smell. Gavin's watch tapping the table. The little red Atlas boxes glowing on the monitor, while he explained to a room full of adults that structure was the enemy of momentum. They thought I was a blocker. What they didn't know is that I was translation. That was always the job. Not approvals. Not process. Translation. Between promise and delivery. Between ego and reporting. Between what sales wanted to say and what a public company could survive saying out loud. Toxic top performers never understand the people who make them possible. They think support functions are scenery. They think other people's restraint is proof they can keep pushing. They think short-term results excuse the damage, right up until the day the quiet people stop absorbing it. Then they meet the actual architecture. Not anger. Not revenge. Not a scene in a hallway. Just the structure reading their words literally. And once that happens, the collapse sounds less like drama than paperwork. If you've ever watched a company protect one loud rainmaker while the competent people quietly carried the cost, you already know why the story lands the way it does. If it hit home, like and subscribe. And tell me in the comments about the person at your old job everyone had to orbit until the numbers finally stopped protecting them. As for me, I slept better once I stopped being furniture in somebody else's story and started building rooms where people knew what the tables were actually for.